What happens when a species that once numbered in the tens of thousands slips into fewer than 10,000 breeding pairs? And almost no one notices until it's nearly too late. New research reveals the silent disaster on South Africa's coastline, where African penguin colonies have collapsed by up to 95% in under a decade. Entire breeding sites, once packed with life, now sit nearly empty. Their disappearance is not a mystery of predators or disease. It is the story of an ocean food web that has failed at the worst possible moment. And a lot of it is due to us. We're going to talk about that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, marine biologist and science communicator, here to tell you what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about what happened to the South African penguins, or African penguins in South Africa. This is something that has been very tragic. It happened from 2004 to 2011. 95% of the population just disappeared, died off, and now we know the answers why, and I'm here to explain that. And I just want to say, before I start to explain that, I've been doing this for 10 years. I've been doing on YouTube for on and off for quite some time, but really for the last year and a half. And the reason I do this is because I love to hear back from you. So if you have comments or any kind of questions or anything like that, you want me to cover something, let me know in the comments below if you've been watching this on YouTube. And if you've been with me on audio for the last 10 years plus, please let me know if you have any questions. You can DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. You can go and you can put up, I can put up a link for you where you can go and give me feedback. We'll speakupforblue.com/feedback. And you can have questions or comments. I love to hear from them. And if you can hit like follow in any of your watching, if you're on YouTube, subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, you hit that follow button. That would make me feel really great. Not only do I want to reach more people and consistently on a consistent basis, I do 3 episodes a week. I just want people to love the ocean just as much as I do and find out what's happening with this ocean. What are we doing to it and how we can make it better for the long run, for not only our health, but the ocean's health. And I think that's something that's really important. I just want to drive this community. I want to build this community so that we can get together and talk about this more often. So in the new year, you're going to start to see some offerings that I'm going to be offering for community so we can actually hear from each other and discuss each other, on the membership sites for YouTube and others. So I just want I want you to be a part of that. I think it's going to be really important. So I'm looking forward to doing that. Those live sessions, it'll be a lot of fun. We get together. So just look out for that. But the biggest thing is if you've been here for a long time or you've just started, welcome. Thank you for joining us. You're always welcome to be here. No matter if you agree with me or not, who cares? Let's just have some fun. Let's get to know the ocean. Let's make it better. All right. That's my PSA for today. Again, thank you for being here. But let's look at this. Before 2004, African penguins had roughly 57,000 breeding pairs across their range. 57,000. That total today has dropped to about 9,900 breeding pairs worldwide. From 57,000 breeding pairs to 9,900 breeding pairs worldwide. That's insane. That should not happen. That should be something that we never have to deal with, but unfortunately it happened. The South Africa holds about 8,700 of those pairs, and then Namibia holds around 1,200 of those pairs. So over the last 30 years, their population has plummeted more than 80%, with some colonies losing 95% of their birds in fewer than 10 years. So now we're trying to find what's going on, because now they're critically endangered. And with those the projections, if it continues to show what we're seeing, they could go extinct from the wild by 2035 if the trend continues. So that's something we don't want to have. So the first question we have to ask is what happened to these penguins, right? First, we got to look at this shocking discovery. The fact that we had 57,000 breeding pairs and we go down to 9,900. So there's 2 major South African colonies. There's Dassin Island and Robben Island. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly. They lost up to 95% of their breeding pair penguins in under a decade. That's the biggest loss that we saw. More than 60,000 birds starved during their most vulnerable life stage. A species that once filled the beaches with noise and movements has nearly vanished from the most important strongholds. The collapse happened quickly and quietly, and then most people never even heard about it until scientists started to publish their new findings. So what happened? What caused the die-offs? Well, the biggest thing was, the trigger was the dramatic die-off of the sardine population on the west coast of South Africa. So sardines are the penguin's primary food source. They provide the best energy and the long-lasting energy, and they're not that quick, not as quick as penguins, and they can get caught pretty easily. And so, but a mix of warming seas, altered salinity, disrupted plankton production, and intense fishing pressure wiped out local sardine stocks. The loss happened at the worst possible time, during the penguins' annual molt. So these sardines disappeared when these penguins molt their feathers that keep them from being wet and cold and everything. And so when they're landbound, they have to stay in land, and they have to use their reserves. They can't go eat, and they can't get the energy they need. They have to use the reserves. They just didn't have as many reserves as possible. So when they go out and eat, they build up those reserves so that when they have to actually molt and they stay on land for a little bit, they have to use their stored fat. But if they don't have enough stored fat to eat, they eventually starve. So without sardines to build those reserves, tens of thousands did not survive. And that just continued to happen year after year after year for 10 years. Now, why 10 years? Why did these penguins not recover? Because even after the initial collapse, the sardine population did not bounce back. Sardine biomass stayed below 1/4 of its historical maximum for nearly 20 years. This sardine population really suffered. Anchovies, which was the next best prey, were not abundant enough in the West to feed the whole distribution, and their distribution actually shifted eastward. So far outside the penguin foraging range, the penguins can only go so far, and when they have their colonies, their breeding colonies, they can't move them, and they can't swim that far. So if the sardines are out of range, if the anchovies are out of range, then they can't eat. Right? They can't move their nesting sites. They cannot travel long distances while they're raising their chicks. So with low energy prey, fewer chicks survived. Adults entered molting underweight, right? When they enter that molting, they don't have enough the fat storage, and the population spiraled downward every year. Replacement prey species were too fast. So the hake and everything else that's around were too fast or too scarce, or too low in fat to support the recovery. So there just wasn't enough, like the anchovies and the sardines, especially the sardines, provided enough for these animals to survive. Now, the shift in distribution of sardines and anchovies happened because the shift in plankton happened, which is the main food source during and after and before sardine and anchovy spawning. So if climate change shifts the wind patterns and shifts the current, it shifts the distribution of plankton, which will shift the distribution of the predator species that eat that prey. So you have anchovies, you have sardines that will shift their distribution away from the colonies. So now these penguins can't move far because they have chicks that they're raising. They have low fat storage, and they're stuck on land while they molt, and they have to use their fat reserves, and they don't have enough fat reserves, so they start to die, and it happens year over year over year. So now that we know what the problem is, we know why it's happening for so long, because these sardines and anchovies just, the collapse happened for quite some time in that area. What is being done? I should mention before we go into that, we're still seeing fishing pressure on sardines that have stayed around. So even though there's a lower population of sardines that have stayed around, we're still seeing fishing of those sardines. So that adds to the pressure of already dwindling population. So now what is being done to help these penguins? Several conservation measures are underway. So governments introduce fishing closures near the key colonies to reduce competition for sardines. Wildlife groups are protecting nests, improving breeding shelters, managing predators, and running rescue programs for injured or starving adults and chicks. Some organizations also hand-reared abandoned chicks and release them back into the wild. Research teams are tracking penguin movement to identify new foraging hotspots and understand environmental changes affecting these sardines. So there's a lot of stuff that is going on, but are they actually successful? Do these efforts matter? Is it enough to bring their populations back up to the 57,000 breeding pairs that they once had? The honest answer is it's actually mixed. These conservation actions have helped individual penguins and improved conditions around some of the nesting sites. However, the underlying issue is the collapse of the sardine stocks. It hasn't been solved. So how do we solve this sardine stock problem, which is really difficult because you're looking at an entire shifting predator-prey situation and a food web switch. So without a significant recovery of prey availability, penguin numbers cannot rebound at the scale it once was. The species is listed now as critically endangered, and projections show that they could disappear from the wild by 2035 if the trends continue to happen. So that's if the sardine populations remain as depressed as they are. Efforts are slowing the decline rather than reversing it. So the thing is sometimes when we talk about conservation, we talk about the efforts that we put together. And sometimes they help locally, but they're not going to help overall because you can only do so much as humans in bringing everything back. One is expensive. It's expensive to do all these efforts. And two, it's not going to happen at scale, which is because the primary problem hasn't been solved. This could help extend their life on this planet by a few years, but it's not going to solve the problem until we can get sardines back in the area or maybe move these colonies to somewhere else, which is a much more difficult problem. So like, what can you do to help? So even though these conservation actions may not be the best thing, it is something that we can do in the meantime to kind of give us some time before the sardines population comes back, hopefully. So you can support any kind of African penguin recovery in several meaningful ways. So support organizations working directly on sardine and penguin conservation. Share science-based information on how climate change and overfishing affect marine life, which doesn't really happen a lot. Choose seafood from sustainable fisheries, of course, and encourage others to do the same. And contact your elected officials to support marine protected areas, science-driven fishing policies, and finally, amplify this story. Share this story. The African penguin crisis is still invisible to much of the world. And unless we get it in front of their eyes or in front of their ears, we cannot help these penguins at the scale that they need help. Far too long, the decline of the penguins went silent. And it's about time that we speak up and we amplify their story. That's what this podcast is all about. That's what this community is all about. I'll tell you one thing, something that happened to me recently. I joined an advocacy group. It was a group on WhatsApp, and it's a bunch of science communicators and creators, content creators that are that work together to get specific campaigns out that we all start or somebody starts as, hey, I need someone to help me amplify this. Can you put it on your story? Can you put it on your Instagram, your TikTok? Can you put it on your podcast? And let's talk about this story, because with this amplification, this style of sharing these stories and putting this on a platform that can be shared with hundreds, with thousands, with hundreds of thousands, with millions, this will help these populations, and people will finally understand the plight these penguins are facing, and hopefully we'll get to the point where we can get policy enacted that can help these fish at scale as well as these penguins at scale. That's the important part of this journey. That's what I want to get across by sharing this story. I hope you share this podcast, whether it's the audio version or video version. If you have a comment or a question, it helps with the algorithm to get it in front of more people. Please let me know. I want this to go everywhere. I want every story to go everywhere, and it's with the help of you, the community, and that we can get together and discuss. I want to get to know you. I want to hear your comments. I want to hear your questions. So if you're watching this on YouTube, put your comment in the comment section below. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app, just let me know. Just go to speakupforblue.com/feedback. Let me know how you feel. You can also go to speakupforblue.com, follow the podcast on your favorite podcast app. I want to thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, from the True North Strong and Free. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.